friends, welcome to the fourth online edition of WOW. And this is a very important session for us where Ankur Besen, who's just got our award for the best book of non-fiction for the year 2019, he is here with us today to discuss Wasted. And along with him, we have Arkaja Singh, a fellow at the Center for Policy Research in the State Capacity Building Unit. Arkaja has degrees from the National Law University at Bangalore and then at the School of Oriental and African Studies, an institution which I always wanted to attend, but then Arkaja is more fortunate than I am. So good to have you with us, Arkaja. And she's done a lot of work on looking at how states at all levels have looked at issues of governance. And of course, today with us in conversation is Ankur Besen. Ankur has done phenomenal work on this subject. It's a subject which has not been explored very often, very much, and that's where the bibliography doesn't have books. It only has references to newspaper articles and current reports because not much has been done on the subject. Therefore, it's a pioneering work, it's a path-breaking work, and let me also share with you that together with Ankur, the Academy is doing a project on looking at the brick kilns in the country to look at how we can take the brick kilns project forward. So without much ado, because once you get into the training setup, you tend to speak for 45 minutes. So I'll put a rein on my thoughts and what I want to say. And over to you, Arkaja. You will allow me to sometimes ask a few questions here and there, but primarily it's a discussion between you and Ankur. Over to you, Arkaja.
Thank you, Dr. Chopra. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be having this discussion. I've read Ankur's book keenly in the past, and I reviewed his book for Biblio. So I've read his book deeply and well. And one of the things I really liked about congratulations first of all on the nonfiction prize. It's very well deserved. One of the things I really liked about your book was the fact that you've taken a very hard look at the question. And by what I mean by that is that it, moves away from sort of commonly held perceptions and commonly held ideas that, commonly held perceptions about solutions, because a lot of the thinking about sanitation happens around, if this was to happen, the problem would be okay. And you've taken a look which is a little bit more, sort of a little bit deeper than that. So, I think it would be good to start with you telling us a little bit about how you problematized the issue for yourself and in the process of, engaging with the question in the way that you did in this book.
Thank you, Arkaja. And first of all, thanks a lot, Dr. Chopra, and to WOW for this honor and for this privilege to be talking on this platform. Yes, Arkaja, it's a good way to start this discussion because how do you problematize is probably the heart of the book. And that's how the book came together. Because one of the triggers for the book was, for me personally, was when you visit outside and you see with various other countries, and then you realize the sanitation standards, the cleanliness standards, and how they've managed to sort of overcome some of these issues, not fully, but partially at least. And then you come back and then you say that, over time we have used broad brushstrokes to define problem of, we have corruption and we have population and governance is not there and all these. So when you start to break this issue, what emerged was a template, which is this book. And the template is about to look at problem from the standpoint of society first and how we are constructed as a society and our society's social contract with the issue of sanitation and the process of sanitation delivery and how skewed it is. And without investigating, without critiquing this arrangement, we can't proceed. The second aspect that emerged was around urban planning of how we build cities. And if you design something which is mediocre, you will get dirty outcomes. And I think that's where the urban planning issue came into being. And then the state capacity. And what I realized is that on many counts, sanitation is a manifestation of the incomplete process of India's democratic setup when it comes to local governance and local governance relationship with state and center, and all these issues come to fore. And if we can't put these things together, and therefore if we start to use broad brushstrokes to solve the issue of sanitation, we miss our mark on many counts. So we use simplistic or linear thinking, and which is what is the second part of it.
There's something useful you said in your book about how the Indian state never quite owned the question of, never quite owned the issue of sanitation. What does that mean really in very simple terms?
Arkaja, if you come to think of it, ownership has two aspects. It's a contract and of ownership where I am assigned responsibility and I'm expected to deliver an outcome. Okay. Now, if you look at the Indian state, incidentally, Madras Municipal Corporation is the second oldest municipal corporation in the world. And I didn't know this. It came into being in 1687, and primarily municipalities were the primary source of sanitation delivery. And that was the world order at that point in time. And till our independence, it continued. Going forward, what we did is, yeah. So,
I said, and it still is, ultimately, even if the municipalities are given no other work, kachra prabandhan, as they say in Hindi, that work is still with them.
So that's it. So what we did is, the way we integrated our municipalities in the democratic setup, they were assigned the toughest task for delivering sanitation, but were not given the tools, were not given frameworks, were not given capacities to deliver on it. So therefore, it became a very sort of a pressured system, which is bound to fail, which is bound to not deliver. Even the best of efforts and the best of sincere attitudes may fail because of this system that is not designed to deliver sanitation. And I think this integration, this lack of integration, is where the issue lies. In terms of the responsibility lies somewhere, but that responsible state actor is not assigned the tools required, the capacity required to deliver it. And I think that's where the issue is as far as governance is concerned on sanitation delivery. I'll give you one example to close this discussion. Sorry.
No, go on.
So if you look into the budgetary allocations of any municipal corporation across the country, and you take sanitation as the issue, 85% of most of the budgets go into non-planned expenditure, which is largely salaries. Now, if that being the case, and if cities are growing, the magnitude is going to generate waste, where do I sort of put capacities, new infrastructure, new thinking, digital, all these ideas, where do I get if whatever is allocated is largely going into just somehow run the show on existing status quo?
So, yes, Dr. Chopra?
What I was thinking is, you see that it also is a question of applying technology. The point which Ankur just made, that till we begin to apply technology to sanitation, until municipal bodies also use technology to assess property taxes and thereby raise more resources, we will not be able to get out of this conundrum. So the issue also is in the way municipalities are taxing properties and getting their stakeholders, So I think that is a very important aspect. I think technology has a way to address both the issues at different ends of the spectrum, but both these are linked. So I think Ankur may like to throw some light on this aspect.
Yeah, sure, sir. Absolutely. Technology has an interesting and a very expansive view when it comes to solving some of these issues around sanitation and around municipalities' ability to generate more revenue. Largely around property taxes, how do you record properties? How do you record incremental changes that have happened in properties within a municipal cluster? All these are now possible through geotagging, through all these technologies that you can put up for display and put up in execution and get this thing sorted. At the same time, in terms of sanitation delivery, also you can use technology to do cluster-wise zoning, to sort of have predictive technologies to see where dumping is happening, dumping is not happening.
I'd like to bring us a few steps back before we go into the technology solutions to the sanitation problem as such.
Yeah,
I'd like us to take a few steps back and, again, go back to something you've dealt with, quite effective, sometimes in a discussion, because we've all read the book. So we can pick certain things, but, our viewers may not have read, may not have picked those bits. So, just to take a few steps back, thinking through the infrastructural responses. So, we had this big municipal problem, and the municipal problem was, quite a lot out of hand at the point when the first big infrastructure, this generation. So let's say 2 decades, we can trace back to the past 2 decades as this generation of infrastructural responses. And so there was the big infrastructure response and the big technology response. And there's a kind of menu of solutions that are included in this infrastructural response that is relevant, but in many ways inadequate. And and then there are other aspects of it. There's the management, there's the people, there is society. So I was wondering whether you could first put the place of infrastructure and the place of technology within the overall story.
Yeah. I think it's an important step back in this discussion. I think what is needed is a segmented view to respond to the infrastructure needed to solve the issue. If I start to list down the kind of waste that we generate, let's take wet waste, sewage, plastic waste, construction and demolition waste, e-waste, automobile waste, apparel waste. All these are wastes that India is generating today by truckloads. Now, every such waste requires a different treatment and a different outlook towards how do you collect it and how do you transport and dispose it. Many of this, quite a few waste types can easily be imagined as resource recovery sources. For example, e-waste or apparel waste or construction and demolition waste can all be imagined if I start to think about resource recovery as an infrastructure response to collect it and to process it. So here you can actually benchmark yourself with some of the leading countries in the world, like Sweden, like Japan, like Denmark, of how they have managed to segregate that and collect it and use it as a resource. But when you come to wet waste, you come to plastic waste, you start to think about recycling as a response. So wet waste, for instance, can easily be converted into organic manure. And think about the linkages between urban and rural as an infrastructure response, which is something that Sikkim has successfully done in the last 20 years. But today, if I think about, say, that I need to resolve this issue, and suddenly I go and ban fertilizer, for instance, will this response succeed? No, it will not succeed, because I don't have supply chains in place. I don't have the infrastructure in place for the linkages to happen between urban centers and rural India. And that's where we need to curb this enthusiasm to take an initiative before thinking about the framework of an infrastructure which needs to be put in place first. And that's where the segmented view comes into picture. So what I've argued in the book, therefore, is to think about this entire waste management as a utility service, just like you will think about power or electricity distribution. So companies that generate electricity are treated as electricity generation as a sector. So you have companies like NTPC and you have all the electricity generation companies, and then you have distribution, where you have finesse and you have capabilities to distribute electricity at home. We need to think exactly like that in reverse, that you need collection entities who have the capability to segregate waste and collect with precision. And then you need disposal entities and an infrastructure response to handle these waste types. And interestingly, just to add, sorry.
No, go on.
No, interestingly, if you come to think of it, some of these responses for the lack of a formal response have already happening. So Panipat, for instance, as a city, is one of the leading centers of apparel waste processing around the world. They actually import apparel waste and they convert that into yarn and they convert that into all kinds of reuse. Alang, we all know, is a leading shipbreaking center in the world, it's nothing but handling ship waste. Moradabad is a leading e-waste center where e-waste is processed. So some of these are already happening informally without probably state knowing or not knowing. So which goes on to say that the economics of it is already ahead in appreciating the thought. We need to formalize this
So
thought
when
and we
we
need to
talk
probably
about
intellectualize.
but when we talk about economics and we talk about entities, they're also people. And one of the so my own moment of insight when understand. So there's I'd like to kind of separate the problem a little bit between solid waste and liquid waste. By liquid waste, what I mean is what comes out of our toilets, and solid waste is what comes out of our kitchens, houses, in domestic use, construction debris, etc. So the solid waste problem, it started to make sense to me for the first time when I saw a solid waste disposal facility in Oroville, and then I saw a few more facilities in Tamil Nadu. And I'd been to many facilities in North India before that, and they were always very foul places. Very very foul places. Really really foul conditions of work, and animals and pests and vermin and human beings, and really 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 like no human being, and nobody should be in those sorts of places. And then I saw these facilities in Tamil Nadu, in Oroville, and they were really nice places. They had, they were really like dignified places. It was possible to have dignified livelihoods in those places. And critically, what they'd done that was different was that the waste was being separated at source. And all your sort of downstream reuse and segmentation, and that whole thing becomes possible if you're separating it in the beginning. And everything becomes manageable if you're separating it in the beginning. There was no smell, there were no flies, there was nothing, there was nothing either unhealthy or undignified about that work. And that then set me off personally in thinking about the power of the people who are doing this work, the power of the people who handle this work. Because a lot of even in real life, where segregation and treatment and recycling is happening, it's often happening in very disempowering conditions. And it was quite interesting for me. They're not entirely successful, but the effort that has been put in by interventions in Pune and Bangalore and some of these South Indian cities, to give the people who work in the waste industry more power. And where does that fit into the story?
Oh, you couldn't have said it any better. Absolutely. Let's start with the math first. If I were to convert the entire informal waste industry into a formal response, I would be creating a $20 billion industry in India alone by harnessing all the kind of waste that I. Now, $20 billion is a sizable sum to link it to social development, to empower communities that are involved in cleaning, in the job of waste. For me, waste is any other technical response. Let's say you may be a mechanical engineer producing auto, you may be a pharmacist who's working in a pharmacy plant. Exactly the same thing applies to waste. So therefore, economically, we have very promising opportunity to use it as a social development tool. Now, the reason why it does not happen is that by the time it trickles down to a response, and with where it demands engagement with cleaning communities, at an isolated level, it becomes a voluntary behavior of two communities coming together, of a mainstream representative having an evolved view and involving these communities. But to expect this to play out for the entire nation becomes a tall order, because the entire thing is based on voluntary expectation. And I think no country in the world has managed to empower cleaning communities on this voluntary expectation of the mainstream society. And that's where the power of legislation and empowerment comes in. If you don't use enforcement, if you don't use legislation to put proactive enforcement in place, cleaning communities will not get empowered. So the reason why Swachh is successful in Pune to that extent is because the municipal corporation in Pune has formalized a social contract with Swachh, and that empowers Swachh to become the waste collector for the areas or the clusters that Swachh serves. So there is a formalization of this relationship that has happened, and state has played an active role. Legislation has played an active role, and enforcement has played an active role. But the moment we take that away and we expect people suddenly to get awakened, if they have not done so in the last 1500 years, why would they do so now going forward? And I think uh, that's where the challenge lies, and that's where the role of state on legislation and on in enforcement needs to be appreciated in a different light as a tool for social development.
So yeah. So this brings us to that, this brings us to the point of, the state had never really owned the question of sanitation. So it left a lot of this work to these informal contracts and to these historical relationships between communities
Yes.
doing waste work and communities paying for that waste work. But, we're still there's still the issue of caste, and there's still this this complicated relationship that communities that certain castes have with waste work, because it's an important source of livelihood. But it also, there is the historical, I mean, you can't do away, I mean, you can't look away from the association between unclean occupations and caste oppression. And and so there is the conflict within communities and within the voices within of the communities also, about whether to move away from that caste work, or those caste based occupations or not. And sometimes it's a difficult choice, because it's difficult for anybody from outside to make that choice, but also people within communities have to have that choice. And the well-meaning interventions that come from outside, and I see a lot of these in the NGO and in the sanitation sector, very well-meaning interventions sort of are designed around people staying in the profession in perhaps renegotiated conditions. So perhaps you could comment a bit about the difficult choices between freedom, dignity, and livelihood.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh, I, you know, I have used an example of Marwari community in the book, and Marwari community's association with the textile and the apparel industry. And what it does is that we need to sort of if we take a step back and take a dispassionate view of the South Asian history of caste association with business activities or social activities, it's a hard truth. You can't escape that. Now let's see what happened with the Marwari communities living in Rajasthan, with these interesting relationships within the families, within the community, and they actually occupied the entire value chain of apparel and textile trade. They branched out to all over the country, and from there emerged big families, textile mills, and till today, apparel and textile with Marwari communities, the association is very strong, and that's from where you have Sixarias and the Birlas of the world, and textile being a big important sector to emerge. Now, I've used the same argument to say, why can't it happen with waste communities, where we take a dispassionate view of waste to say that it is an important, powerful tool of social development, of social mobility, upward mobility. Why can't us see within that community entrepreneurs a sector to develop where communities take charge of this entire sector, harness that value, and whatever value is generated becomes a tool to empower this community. Yes, surely there should be, and without doubt, there should be an optionality for communities to seek solutions or seek a sort of a breakout away from this association. But the moment you start to look at this entire sector in a different light, with formal contracts in place, with economic models sort of emerging, this entire urge to break away will actually get reversed, and say that yes, there is enough value in growing this sector. And that's how this entire emphasis on formalization is something I tend to side with, rather than, and that's where the debate needs to be pushed, where it is not so much about waste per se to be discriminated, but it is about appreciating it as a resource recovery industry and using it as a template for social development. Because yes, it is a given that it has been used as a tool for marginalization, for discrimination, and there is no doubt that it still continues to do so. So we have two options. One is to sort of say that dealing this caste away, dealing this discrimination, take the communities out of this profession. And it's a well-meaning intention. It's a sincere intention, but it's not going to solve the problem of sanitation. Who's going to come?
So I like
How are you
yeah.
going to
So
solve it?
I like the point you make about emphasis on formalization. I think it's a little bit, the two things are very closely linked. Why is this work the most informal? Why, there are reasons why this work is most informal. And I think the emphasis on formalization is very well taken because it moves us away from historically sort of under-resourcing the business. And because it's historically under-resourced, safety standards cannot be maintained because, nobody spent enough money in building the correct sort of infrastructure or providing the correct sort of machinery and technology. So I think this is a very important point, and it can't be said, enough times. I have to say I'm a bit uncomfortable with the direct analogy with the Marwari community because I feel, there's difference in this, in the power and position of Dalit and Marwari communities. But let's move on from that to a related point about these boutique interventions. And it's another point you make very well at this point about you can't have little bits here and there and expect that you can't. You have to look at the entire story. And can you talk a little bit about what you mean by these small niche feel good interventions?
Yeah,
which are often,
and not to take away
in the context of the Indian state and in the context of bureaucracy, these small niche feel-good interventions are often sort of packaged as innovations. And, sometimes they are, in their little way, they are innovations. But it's, there's a scope and a limit to that sort of innovation.
Yes.
Let me move in here for a moment and say that, this is a question that needs to be addressed. But before that, I'd like to take on this whole debate between the formal and the informal. And at some point of time, Ankur mentions, that there is the formal city and there's the informal city. The informal city, which is the slums and which is all the other things, which is not formal, which is not even, it's certainly extra legal because it is not illegal, but it is not in the domain of the legal. And also the fact that the formal is visible and the informal is not visible. So the informal is invisible and the formal is visible. And that's why it's so difficult for the formal to actually take into account the very wide diversity which exists in the informal in our city. And I think that's also very important if we have to address the elephant in the room. And of course, the boutique issue, you'll have to address that as well.
So I'll take your question first, Dr. Chopra, and then we'll come to boutique.
Just to add to Dr. Chopra's question, also the sort of interlinkage between formal and informal. The formal city is sometimes not that formal, and the informal city is not that informal. And looking closely at the business of waste management brings us face to face with how informal the formal city really is. Add that to the question.
I think it's a very valid intervention. Yes, please.
So I think the migrant crisis that has recently unfolded has exposed the city's fault lines on this debate of formality and informal living on many counts. The structure is simple. If you pick up any city in India today, 1/4 of India to 1/3 of India will be actually living in slums in any city. You pick tier 1 city, metro city, mini metro city. And the two things you need to take into account. One is, why does informality exist in the first place? Why is it that we are unable to sort of take out slums from the narrative of urbanism in India? And second is, what is the relationship of informal with the formal existence, to the point that Arkaja made? So we realize that the way cities and the urban narrative of India is developing, it is actually created many pressure points between the formal living and the informal living. To come to think of it, 65 million households out of the 100 million households in India are not connected to any sewage system. So it does not matter whether you have a toilet at home or you seek open defecation. You don't have any onward visibility of your sewage in any city in India to the tune of 65% of the urban population. So think about now this data point. Think about this data point from a gated community and a flat, who we can perceive and we can think about it as a formal existence, and think about a slum in the neighborhood, and the sewage that is generated in both actually has same suboptimal outcome, because I don't have visibility on the sewage where it goes, and I will need to engage the services of manual scavenging or the informal workforce to get the sewage clean in both the outcomes. So what is informal and what is formal therefore becomes a very vague sort of an assessment of the situation. At the same time, so that's one aspect to answer Arkaja's question, because many of the informal setups are actually designed to serve as formal living, and Dharavi is a good example for Bombay. If you take Dharavi away, the entire recycling of waste that happens informally will collapse, and Bombay will actually drown in its own waste if Dharavi was not there in the first place. So plastic recycling, your apparel recycling, or e-waste, or whatever you say, it happens is rooted through Dharavi. So Dharavi is that elephant in the room that actually supports formal living. So to that point, now therefore, if I take a step back and say, how can I design my city which does not have informality in my narrative, which does not have slums in my narrative, and that's where you need to sort of take a socialist viewpoint, perhaps, of what Europe did in the post World War II economy, of how housing as an issue was addressed, public housing as an issue was addressed, spaces and were zoned out in cities for different usages, the interlinkages were balanced out. In some ways, they have resolved some issues. In some ways, they have not. So today, Paris and London continue to be ghettos for migrants who came from Africa, from Asia. But at the same time, they have solved part of the problem, that they are slum free, because they also had slums 100 years back and 150 years back. So I think, therefore, if I summarize this into two parts, one is urban planning and urbanism and sanitation go hand in hand. You can't solve the issue of sanitation with mediocre designs of cities, and I think that needs to be understood. There needs to be a wider debate involving citizens, involving stakeholders, for the rights of how the city should be designed and how space should be allocated.
And can I just add to that
And
with mediocre? Can I just add one of my pet peeves to that, which is mediocre design of infrastructure, because the idea that somebody else is going to deal with that waste and that infrastructure doesn't really need to work means that a lot of the infrastructure really doesn't work.
Yeah, correct. And tomorrow, Arkaja, perhaps what has worked in the past, that we have been designed to think about roads, we have been designed to think about cities with cars and garage, we have designed to think about suburban living and plotted development. All this go out of the window in the next 20-30 years with climate change and stress on the resources. Probably we need to think about urban designs from the standpoint of community living, from industrial hostels, from public transport, from bikes and trails for pedestrians, pedestrian rights. Today, for example, in Delhi, if let's say Mohalla clinics are rolled out, the design never provision for Mohalla clinics. So you are actually carving out spaces from here and there to think about Mohalla clinics, and you're creating. But tomorrow, if public health needs to be thought through, it needs to be integrated with urban design to say, I need to create space for my primary clinics. I need to create space for the aging population. I don't have old age homes.
So,
I think
two things.
another
One,
point.
go on,
Go
Dr.
on,
Chopra.
Arkaja.
No, I was wanting to bring us back to the time, bring us back to the fact that our session was about to wrap up. And I'm sure, people who don't know Ankur are keen to hear a little more of his thoughts about the writing process. He has a day job, and then he has this, this. I thought it would be good if, before we wrap up, Ankur could talk a little bit about his own, his own process of, how do you become a writer in your spare time, and the process, things that sort of the signposts along his way that led him this way in some sense. What were the
Sure.
So
important
go on.
conversations that you had, important things that you saw that that led you into this?
Yeah, sure. So, so it took me about 5.5 years to put this book or to bring this book to life. And I think what I realized, and I'm first time author, so it's a lonely process. Writing is a lonely process, and what you're doing in this process is you're talking to yourself. You're discovering yourself more in the process rather than anything else. So if you're talking to yourself and you put constantly you put yourself as an audience or as a reader of the book, uh, it becomes interesting journey of writing the book, because as a writer you are constantly talking to yourself as a reader. It's like one person playing chess from both sides. I think that's the analogy that I can at least think about myself as a writer. Because in a day job, my writing would start at 11 o'clock in the night, will go till 2, 2:30, 3 o'clock, and then I would wrap up, and then I go for my day job. While I'm traveling, I've written in cafes, on flights, thoughts here and there, and then when you put it together, it becomes lonely. So but at the same time, what I also realize is that if you don't enjoy it, if it's not something that's your true calling, it becomes stressful. So I don't think I have any complaints of the fact that I spent 5 years. So I use it as more as an expression of pleasure rather than as an expression of pain, because I really enjoyed the process. And I think that's something that came out while I took up this process of writing. And people do talk to me about what are the tips in writing and what do you suggest. I only tell them 2 3 things. One is, uh, don't think about the book till the time you've put 20,000 words, black and white. So till the time you don't have 10, 15,000 words, 20,000 words that talk to you, and you are convinced that your words do justice to the reader in you, only then you can think about next step as in the journey of book writing. Uh, that's one. Second is being in nonfiction. Uh, how do you sort of frame? How do you research? Becomes an interesting discovery process. I made a lot of friends. I discovered new areas. It was something that was not part of my repertoire or not part of my checklist in the day job. So I think that became extremely rewarding as a process. Dr. Chopra, you were
Yeah,
asking
that's
something.
No, it's fine. I think Arkaja said the right. I wanted to know from both of you. You see, what is the Hindi or the Sanskrit equivalent of wasted? Because I think as a civilization, there was no concept of waste, because that's a post-industrial revolution thing. Because before that, everything was being recycled. And you talked of the connect between the urban and the rural, about how the sewage would go to the field. And I still remember that in Kapurthala, my hometown, the municipality would auction these sewerage rights, because this used to be full of fertilizer and it used to be used in the fields. So, do we have an ancient equivalent of the word wasted, or is the word waste itself a post-industrial revolution phenomenon?
I think part of it is post-industrial, sir. Surely, I think because we can't have any historical references to the kind of waste that we generate today. So
Yeah,
part
because
of
we
that,
had gun,
and
gun this dirt. So dirt is not wasted. So there is
yeah,
a little etymological difference between these two
yeah,
things.
yeah.
So we are at the end of
Ma-
the near end of a absolutely wonderful session. But let me just say, let me add here, and I'd like both of them, both the discussant and the author, to discuss this. The subtitle is A Manifesto for Change. Now, if you had everything going right for you, what would be the 3 steps that you would list out as the manifesto for change, which is doable in, say, the next 3 or 4 years? I mean, let's say till India turns 75 and we had 2 years to act or intervene. First to you, Arkaja, and then to the author, and then we close. Arkaja.
3 steps. Sorry, it just Dr.
3.
Chopra. 3
Yes.
steps manifest.
Yeah, 3 steps. Your wish list.
I'd say, power to the people who work, power, more, shift power towards the people who actually have to deal with waste, so that, okay, so that's 1. 2, infrastructure design, engineering quality. And 3, and these are very technical things. If I had time to think about it, I might have said more abstract things. But the 3rd would be state accountability. The 3rd, people say, state accountability for, finally the buck has to stop with the state. Lots of people, lots of businesses, lots of enterprises can be doing what they have to do. They can have little parts in the story, but holding the whole narrative together has to be, in a modern state, has to be the responsibility of the state.
Thank you, Arkaja. Over to you, Ankur.
So my wish list will be, first is to redraw the correct targets that we need to seek for sanitation. So instead of seeking broad targets, perhaps if we can be more specific about what targets we want to seek. For example, complete ban on open landfills. How many people of the 1 million rag pickers have we reduced, or have we transitioned to formal existence? What is the resource recovery percentage? How many effluent treatment plants are operational? How many are up and running? These are hard targets that we should pursue, measurable targets, and probably that can put pressure point in the system. The second ask for me is to de-link the issue of waste collection and waste disposal. Waste disposal needs to be an infrastructure response, and state needs to put frameworks in place for disposal or resource recovery industry to rise. And waste collection should be used as a tool to empower local bodies and to use it as a tool for bringing precision in waste collection and segregation. And the third is, I will also reinforce social contracts that are currently skewed in favor of mainstream society to be shifted to in favor of cleaning communities. That's the point that Arkaja made. We need to price waste and for its entire value chain with a purpose that most of that benefit should go to the cleaning communities for their rights and for their representation.
Thank you very much. I think it's been a wonderful discussion. It's left all of us more enlightened. I mean, certainly I feel that it's been one of the most empowering discussions. And to sum it all up, you see the point which Arkaja made, power to the people. And to that, Ankur made the point, more power to the people who are actually engaged in the process, and to ensure that they get the value in the entire value chain, so that they are empowered. There is technology in their hands. That's the first point. Linked to that is the point of infrastructure. If we had better infrastructure, more formalization, better job security, then more people would want to opt for this. Last but not the least, state accountability, which means accountability with the functional resources. So it's not just that the municipal corporation has to be told that you have to do this, but the Finance Commission also has to ensure that the municipality has the resources to do it. And the municipality must also ramp up its own property tax collection, and those who are in the apparently formal sector to pay more for all the informal services which they are drawing. So I think that's the point which Arkaja was making. And the point which Ankur, and in fact, all of us are making the same point, but the point which Ankur has emphasized is that the entire process has to be measurable. We must measure our targets, because, as they say in the management jargon, whatever is not measured is never going to be resolved. And the most important thing is that waste collection and waste disposal are two different domains, two different expertise, two different sets of expertise are required. So while the waste collection will have to be done at the level of the municipality, the waste disposal and the reuse, recycle, and the revaluation of that waste is something which has to be organized and we will have to put the topmost infrastructure system in place for that. And last but not the least, social accountability, social contracts. These need to change, and most importantly, more such books have to be written. More such books have to be written. More such books have to be read. And if I could say, more such books have to be acknowledged. More power to your pen, Ankur. More power to your pen, and I hope that we soon have regional language translations for this book, so that this message and this discourse cuts across all sections of society. I also take this opportunity of informing our colleagues that together with Ankur, the Academy is now working on a book which has been which is on brick kiln, on the workers in the brick kilns, because that's another sector which we felt has been totally neglected. So in the next 3 or 4 months, you can look forward to another book by Ankur Besen. The title is not yet clear, but that's what I want to say, is that, this is an area which was not a part of literature festivals. I'm glad that Ankur has brought this to the domain of literature festivals. We need more such books in the mainstream discussion. Thank you, Ankur. Thank you, Arkaja, for a very lively discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chopra. Thank you, Arkaja. Such a nice moderator you are.
Thank you.